Put your fingers in your mouth. Press the tip of your tongue against the ridge behind your lower teeth. Shape the opening of your lips into something between a kiss and a circle. Now push air from your diaphragm, hard, through that narrow passage. If you've done it right, if the angle is correct and the pressure is sufficient, a sound will come out of you that is older than writing, older than cities, older than agriculture, older than any technology the human species has ever built. A whistle, a high, sustained, piercing tone that travels further than the human voice, further than a shout, further than a scream, cutting through wind and distance and forest canopy and mountain rock with a clarity that spoken language cannot match. 5 kilometers, 3 miles, from one ridge to another, from one valley floor to the opposite summit, across a distance that would take an hour to walk in less than a second. That sound was a language, not a signal, not a code, not a simplified series of alerts like a referee's whistle or a shepherd's call. A full language, complete, articulate, capable of expressing any thought a spoken sentence could express, any tense, any nuance, any spontaneous, unrehearsed idea that one person needed to transmit to another across a distance that made ordinary speech impossible. And it existed everywhere. The deeper I went into the evidence, the more I found that this wasn't a quirk. It wasn't an anomaly confined to one clever island culture or one isolated mountain village. Whistled languages have been documented in at least 80 cultures on every inhabited continent on Earth. From the Canary Islands to the mountains of Turkey, from the highlands of Oaxaca in Mexico to the forests of Cameroon, from the valleys of Nepal to the dense jungle canopy of Papua New Guinea, from the Pyrenees of France to the tonal highlands of Laos and Vietnam, from Alaskan Yupik communities to the Bora of the Peruvian Amazon. 80 cultures, every continent, independently developed, without contact, without transmission, without any shared source. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Wherever the terrain made shouting ineffective, wherever distance separated people who needed to communicate, wherever the landscape demanded a voice that could carry further than the human throat was designed to project, people discovered that the body already contained the solution, not in the larynx, not in the vocal cords, in the whistle. A sound that the human anatomy produces with almost no effort, but that travels distances the spoken voice cannot reach. A sound that rides wind instead of fighting it, that bounces off cliff faces instead of dissolving into them, that cuts through forest canopy instead of being absorbed by it. This raises a simple but critical question. If 80 cultures on every continent independently developed the same solution to the same problem, what does that tell us about the human body's relationship to sound? Start with what the science shows, because the science is extraordinary and almost nobody knows about it. In 2005, a team of neuroscientists led by Manuel Carreras studied the brains of Silbo-Gomero speakers on the island of La Gomera in the Canary Islands. Silbo-Gomero is the most thoroughly documented whistled language in the world, a whistled transposition of Spanish that uses 2 whistled vowels and 4 whistled consonants to reproduce the full complexity of spoken Castilian. Shepherds and farmers on this volcanic island have used it for centuries to communicate across the deep ravines and narrow valleys that make walking between villages an ordeal that whistling solves in seconds. What the neuroscientists found was this. When trained Silbo speakers heard whistled language, their brains processed it in Broca's area and Wernicke's area, the exact same regions that process spoken language. Not the auditory cortex, not the music centers, the language centers. The brain did not treat whistled speech as sound. It treated it as language. A follow-up study in 2015, examining Mazatec whistled speech in Mexico, found the same thing. same neural pathways, same left hemisphere dominance, same linguistic processing, two completely unrelated whistled languages on two different continents based on two structurally different spoken languages, and the brain handled both of them the same way it handles a sentence spoken aloud in any language on Earth. The evidence suggests something much larger than a regional curiosity. Because here's what that means. The human brain does not distinguish between whistled language and spoken language. At the neurological level, they are the same thing. The information is encoded differently, transmitted through a different acoustic channel, but the brain receives it, processes it, and understands it through identical mechanisms. This means that whistled language is not a substitute for spoken language. It is not a simplified code. It is language, full, complete, neurologically identical language, produced by a different part of the same body, using a different property of the same air. And the body knew this before the neuroscientists did. 80 cultures figured it out without brain scans. They figured it out because they needed to talk to someone on the other side of a mountain, and their bodies provided a way, not their technology, their bodies. The whistle is built into the human anatomy the way echolocation is built into a bat. It is a biological capacity for long-distance communication that the species has carried for as long as it has existed, activated by necessity, transmitted through culture, and processed by the brain as real language. I want to pause here and ask something that isn't usually asked. What would it have been like to live in a world where the landscape talked? Not metaphorically. Actually. Imagine standing on a hillside in the Canary Islands in the 16th century. The valley below you stretches 2 kilometers across. On the far ridge, a figure appears. Without raising a hand, without lighting a fire, without sending a messenger on an hour-long walk down one slope and up another, the figure puts fingers to mouth and a sentence crosses the valley. Not an alarm, not a warning signal, a sentence, a piece of news, an invitation, a joke, and you answer. Your whistle carries back across the same distance, and a conversation unfolds between two people separated by terrain that would take an hour to cross on foot, conducted at the speed of sound, in complete linguistic complexity, using nothing but the body. Now imagine that landscape multiplied across the world. In the mountains of Turkey's Black Sea region, an entire village communicating across steep forested slopes in what they call Kush Dili, the bird language. In the highlands of Oaxaca, Mazatec farmers whistling across coffee plantations in a tonal language so precise that entire spontaneous conversations could be held without a single spoken word. In the Pyrenees, in a French village called As, shepherds managing flocks across mountain passes using whistled Béarnese. In West Africa, Ewe and Yoruba communities using drum language, a parallel system that encoded the tonal properties of their spoken languages into rhythmic patterns that carried for miles. The deeper I went, the more I realized that the world before telecommunications was not silent. It was not isolated. It was not a place where distance meant separation. It was a world in which the human body itself was a long-distance communication device, and communities had spent centuries refining that capacity into systems of extraordinary precision and beauty. And then the systems died, not all at once, not in a single event, but with a consistency and a speed that, the deeper I looked, stopped seeming coincidental. The Silbo Gomero nearly went extinct in the second half of the 20th century. Not because the terrain changed, not because the ravines filled in, because the telephone arrived. And when the telephone arrived, the institutional attitude toward whistled language shifted with remarkable speed, from essential communication infrastructure to folk curiosity, from practical necessity to cultural heritage, from living language to museum piece. The same pattern played out in Turkey, where Kuş Dili went from a daily communication system used by thousands to a festival attraction with a few hundred fluent speakers. In Mexico, Mazatec and Chinantec whistled speech declined alongside the indigenous languages they were built on, squeezed from one side by Spanish dominance and from the other by cell phones and walkie-talkies. In the French Pyrenees, whistled Bernese is functionally extinct. The silence was deafening. Because here's what the replacement actually looked like, community by community, across the world. A technology arrived that did what the body had been doing. It transmitted voice across distance. But the technology did it through a device rather than through the body, through a wire or a signal rather than through the air, through a system owned by a company rather than a skill owned by a person. And once the technology arrived, the skill was no longer transmitted, not suppressed, not forbidden, simply not taught. Parents stopped teaching children because the children didn't need it. The telephone was easier. The cell phone was easier still. And within a single generation, a capacity that the human body had carried for millennia, a capacity that the brain processed as real language, a capacity that 80 cultures on 6 continents had independently discovered and refined, went quiet, as if they were following instructions they didn't fully understand. Count the losses. Whistled languages are not the only body-based communication system that was replaced by technology and then forgotten. Drum languages across West and Central Africa encoded tonal languages into rhythmic patterns that could carry between villages. The Kile people of the Democratic Republic of the Congo used drum language to announce births, deaths, marriages, and public events. That system is now extinct. Smoke signals, fire signals, mirror signals, horn calls, yodeling as a long-distance communication system in the Alps. Every one of these body and landscape-based communication technologies has been replaced by a device and then categorized as primitive, as if the body's capacity to project meaning across distance were merely a crude precursor to the telephone rather than a parallel technology that required no infrastructure, no subscription, no electricity, no corporation, and no vulnerability to the failure of any system external to the human being using it. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision across every domain I've examined. A capacity that belongs to the body, replaced by a capacity that belongs to a device. A skill held by the community, replaced by a product sold by a company. A system that required nothing but the human being, replaced by a system that requires everything except the human being. Here's what the research shows about what happens when whistled languages survive. In La Gomera, where the local government made Silbo Gomero a mandatory subject in schools in 1999, children who learn the system show the same left hemisphere neural activation as native spoken language users. They don't just learn a trick, they activate a linguistic capacity. Their brains develop an additional channel for processing language, a channel that exists in the architecture of every human brain, but that is only activated by training. Every human being alive has the neurological hardware for whistled language. Every brain on Earth is wired to process it. What varies is not the capacity. It is whether anyone teaches you to use it. This raises a simple but critical question. What does it mean that every human brain has the capacity for a form of language that almost no one is taught? The deeper I went, the more the shape of the thing became visible. Not as a single conspiracy with a single architect, but as a pattern. A recurring, cross-cultural, multi-century pattern of allowing the body's own capacities to atrophy as technology assumes the functions those capacities once served. We didn't lose the whistle because it stopped working. It works as well as it ever did. 5 kilometers across a valley at the speed of sound using nothing but lungs and lips and tongue. We lost it because something else was sold to us that did the same job through a device we had to buy, on a network we had to subscribe to, using infrastructure we had to depend on. And the dependence is the point. Because a person who can whistle a complete sentence across a mountain valley is a person who does not need a telephone. A community that can communicate across 5 kilometers using nothing but the body is a community that does not need a network. A civilization in which 80 cultures independently developed full linguistic systems requiring zero external technology is a civilization in which the human body is sufficient. Not primitive, not crude, sufficient, capable of things that we have been taught to believe require machines. I don't have a complete theory. I have a question that multiplies the deeper I look. Why did a capacity documented in 80 cultures on every continent, processed by the brain as full language, requiring no technology and no infrastructure, disappear in a single century? Why is it taught in only one school system on one island? Why do linguists estimate that most surviving whistled languages will be extinct within a generation? Why is a neurological capacity shared by every human brain on Earth treated as a folk curiosity rather than as evidence of something fundamental about what the human body can do? I'll leave you with this. Your brain can process whistled language. Right now, the neural pathways are there. The architecture is in place. It has been in place since before your species built its first shelter. If someone taught you, if someone put their fingers to their lips on the other side of a valley and sent a sentence across the wind, your brain would receive it the same way it receives the words you're hearing now, not as sound, as language, as meaning. Nobody taught you, not because you couldn't learn, because the device that replaced the body was easier to sell than the skill that made the body sufficient. And somewhere in a valley in the Canary Islands, an old man puts his fingers in his mouth and sends a sentence 3 miles across a ravine. His granddaughter hears it. She understands it. She answers. 2 human bodies, separated by a distance that would take an hour to walk, having a conversation at the speed of sound, using nothing that was manufactured, nothing that requires a battery, nothing that can be shut off by anyone. That was the language. That was what the body could do before we were told it couldn't.